Jesse Sullivan is an art historian specializing in late medieval and early Renaissance art with a BFA from the Maryland Institute of the College of Art and an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art. She is currently pursuing her PhD at Temple University with a university fellowship. Following a project begun in 2018, she spent the summer of 2019 with Pratt in Venice, researching a 15th century altarpiece in situ. The access to specialized libraries and conservation documents, alongside the overall experience of the program, solidified strains of thought that make the foundation of her specialized field and are related to her coming dissertation. So I'm delighted to introduce Jesse Sullivan, who participated in 2019 and has wonderfully stayed in touch. Jesse.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that I am presenting in Philadelphia from the historic land of the Lenape people. So in the mid-16th century, this large Quattrocento altarpiece of the Madonna and Child enthroned was reinstalled in the Morosini family chapel in the newly rebuilt Venetian church of San Francesco della Vigna. This altarpiece, which I will be referring to as the Morosini altarpiece, tells a complex story of alteration and renovation in a uniquely Venetian manner. Due to the exceptionally multi-source aesthetic cultivated in Venice since the Middle Ages, as well as the accelerated rate of religio-aesthetic evolution that occurred in the second half of the 15th century, it had long been assumed that the visual incongruities present in this altarpiece were simply relics of the period. It was not until its conservation in 2008, sponsored by Save Venice, that it was determined that the altarpiece was constructed in not 2, but 3 distinct periods. This presentation will examine the religious, aesthetic, and patron-driven motivations behind a series of changes that were made within a quarter of a century in the Quattrocento. By utilizing conservation files, by tracing the history of the church and the Morosini family, and through careful stylistic analysis, I will elucidate the subtle aspects of the multiple campaigns of change present in this remarkable altarpiece. I will propose the artistic trainings of the 2 Quattrocento painters and explain the reason behind such changes. The painter of the central section, signed Fra Antonio da Negroponte in a cartouche at the base of the Virgin's throne, may be associated with the ambit of Francesco Squarcione's Paduan Academy. For the outer section, I will strengthen the argument for its inclusion in the oeuvre of Dario di Giovanni. It can be tempting to believe that an altarpiece is completed the moment it is installed in a church, and that the role of an art historian is to untangle the production of the painting up to that point. Typically, it is at an altarpiece's installation that the artist's contract is fulfilled, with occasional exceptions regarding simple upkeep. Yet, altarpieces continue to exist as active liturgical objects, engaging with their communities, and are often reworked and transformed for reasons of aesthetic modernization and updated notions of devotional potency. This evolution is exemplified in the complex additions and alterations made to the Morosini altarpiece. The church and convent of San Francesco della Vigna was founded in 1254 on a vineyard donated to the Franciscan Ordine di Frati Minori. It remained a fundamentally Gothic structure until 1534, when Jacopo Sansovino rebuilt the church in the Renaissance style. The current altar and the extensive marble framing structure around the Morosini altarpiece seen here were constructed shortly after 1545, when the Morosini family rebuilt their chapel in Sansovino's redeveloped building. It had long been assumed that any pre-modern alterations made to this altarpiece were undertaken at this point. However, significant changes were made in the Quattrocento mere decades after Antonio da Negroponte signed his name. In this slide, the areas of the 3 primary periods of production have been delineated. The inner area, including the Virgin and Child down to the verdant bottom of the altarpiece, was created first. Though there is no surviving documentation regarding this initial commission, stylistic analysis dates it to the 1450s. After the inner panel's creation, but before the altarpiece's installation a century later in Sansovino's rebuilt church, a second artist was commissioned to create a new painted setting for the inner figures of the Madonna and Child. This was determined through twofold consideration of the panel construction and by analysis of the pigments. The materials tested throughout the altarpiece are consistent with those used in the Renaissance, but the quality of the pigments, both their material and grind, is superior in the outer Quattrocento section highlighted in pink. This improved value would be appropriate for an addition made to a treasured altarpiece. It is easily seen that the lunette of God the Father was painted at a different period. Though the putti heads are similar in scale to those in the lower section of the altarpiece, the softness of the forms and the way in which the paint is handled suggests they were created in the Cinquecento, unlike the harder Quattrocento aesthetics of the lower section. This lunette has been attributed to Benedetto Rusconi or Francesco Bisoli, with the proposed date of around 1510. Whether it was produced for the Morosini altarpiece or acquired already made cannot be determined definitively, though the incongruous sizing, especially apparent in the upper left, suggests the latter. I propose that the inner section of the Morosini altarpiece, which includes Antonio da Negroponte's signature, was painted in the 1450s. This is supported by a document confirming that an Antonio Foliere from the Venetian colony of Negroponte was working as a painter in Venice between 1449 and 1469. Antonio Foliere was probably trained in Francesco Squarcione's institute in Padua. This is a stylistic assertion formed from the way in which the antiquities and the massive throne are incorporated, as well as the particular stylizations of Mary's hands and the faces of the Christ child and attending angels. This is additionally bolstered by the known activity of the Morosini family in Padua during the Quattrocento. It is known that Piero Morosini, the uncle of Marcantonio Morosini, who in 1508 purchased the marble for the frame that currently surrounds the altarpiece, was embedded in the social circle of erudite and artistically inclined Paduans. A document from 1430 references a rector of San Michele in Padua from a Greek Venetian colony near Negroponte called Candia, overseeing a funding dispute between Jacopo Bellini and two painters, a Nicolaus de Candia, who was living in Venice at the time, and an Antonio living in Padua. The date of 1430 is compatible with the proposed timeline as the period at which Antonio Foliere was honing his craft. Though this document does not reference Antonio as from Negroponte, it remains plausible that the Antonio referenced in this document is the very one who would go on to prominently sign his name as the master of this Madonna and Child. This early association with Jacopo Bellini would account for the stylistic similarities with Bellini noted by Ettore Merkel in his 1979 article on this altarpiece, as well as the strong Paduan elements present in this painting. The putti that inhabit the reliefs on either side of the throne exemplify a trend for the inclusion of playful putti, which had a vogue across media and would last through the second half of the Quattrocento. From 1447 to 1449, Donatello created a cast bronze relief altar for the Paduan Basilica of St. Anthony, which included a series of putti musicians in niches. These reliefs provide a likely inspiration for the illusionistic relief putti on the throne. The analogous scale of the attending angels on either side of the Virgin and Child reference the popular theme of the classical world as a prefiguration of the Christian world. The placement and scale of the angels draw attention to their putti parallels depicted in relief. The faces of the attending angels are depicted with a slightly misshapen softness that has parallels with the works attributed to Francesco Squarcione and his school, such as the della altarpiece. Though it survives in a partially ruined state, there are enough similarities in the handling of the figures to propose a shared training. These similarities are most evident in the pinched, slightly lopsided faces of the angels and the elongated, rubbery hands of Mary. A series of panels from a large disassembled polyptych, occasionally attributed to Squarcione by a painter known as the Master of the Cartellini, also share marked similarities in the handling of the Christ child and attending angels in the Morosini altarpiece. The outer area of the trellised garden, the top of the throne, the arched garland, and the sky above were painted approximately a decade or two later by an artist whose oeuvre has been grouped under the moniker Master of the Stories of Helen. These works have been attributed to Dario Di Giovanni by the Walters Art Museum, who owns the Stories of Helen series. There are a number of other paintings which have been linked together under this artistic personality, and these share definitive similarities with the handling of the plants, throne, and faces in the outer section of the Morosini altarpiece. Though De Giovanni evidently took care to unify his additions with the interior panels, his unique artistic personality is still apparent, providing fertile ground for connoisseurship. The striking similarities with panels painted by Dario de Giovanni between 1465 and 1470 indicate a similar proposed date for the Morosini edition. The depiction of this background rose trellis is almost exactly consistent with the trellis in the background of the Morosini altarpiece. Strengthening the attribution further is the way in which the putti who populate the clouded sky are depicted. These angels share a marked resemblance with the faces of the figures that inhabit the Garden of Love and Stories of Helen panels. The highlights on the faces built up over gray-brown shadows with hot pink spots flushing the cheeks, and the carefully outlined locks of blonde hair are congruous. None of the panels attributed to Dario de Giovanni include an arched garland similar to the one in the Morosini altarpiece. However, the geometric depictions of the bouquet of fruit and leaves have a distinct similarity with the background foliage in A Roman Hero. The arched garland was a popular motif in altarpieces from the second half of the 15th century. Its inclusion in the Morosini altarpiece can be seen as a signifier of modernity, found in Bartolomeo Vivarini's Sacra Conversazione of roughly 1465 and Marco Zoppo's Pesaro altarpiece of 1471. The assimilation between the outer panels to the inner section was achieved both by continuing the elements of the throne and foreground garden, and by painting directly on the interior panels, as can be seen clearly in the fluttering vermilion ribbons. More subtly, the new artist painted in the columns on either side of the Virgin's head and torso. These smaller, slightly finicky details of pomegranate and floral motifs share more with the aesthetics of the upper part of the throne than with the solid marble constructions of Antonio Foliere. What can only be seen through infrared reflectography is a change made to the cloth drapery behind the Virgin. A pattern below the surface of a carefully delineated silk can be seen. In its current state, there is a rich blue fabric hung with ermine tail decorations at the top and decorated with delicate gold symbols with the letter M, likely referencing either the Morosini family or possibly to Marcantonio Morosini directly, who was active in the construction and upkeep of the family chapel throughout the end of the 15th century and into the 16th. The original appearance of the altarpiece was likely a Sacra Conversazione with a small donor portrait. This was a common and popular format across Italy during the mid-15th century, and this composition has been suggested by other scholars. Through careful examination of the infrared reflectography taken during the 2008 conservation funded by Save Venice, I uncovered the possible remnants of a small praying hand present in the lower section of the throne that had not been noticed before. Here, the lines of the hand have been outlined to make it clearer. This potential underdrawing is now covered by a veneer of marble painted over by Dario de Giovanni. Though the depiction of the hand is exceedingly faint, the lines that would make up the fingers and thumb do not correlate with any marble streaks. Donor portraits were often scaled down, and the presence of the shrunken attending angels suggests that Antonio Foliere was comfortable playing with scale in the service of devotional hierarchy. Because the strict profile view was standard for donor portraits in the 1450s, it is eminently possible that when the additions were made, the new painter had only to cover over the hands while the rest of the donor's body was on the discarded outer panels. When the outer panels were added, the iconography of the altarpiece was changed. I have demonstrated how Dario de Giovanni was comfortable painting over the interior panels. And in an examination of the conservation files, I uncovered another possible alteration made in this period. This is in the position of the left arm of the Christ child. This change may have been carried out with the purpose of changing an iconographic element. A deep shadow emanating from Christ's elbow is visible to the naked eye as a fold in the Virgin's inner drapery, but is noticeably darker than the other folds in infrared reflectography. The original position of Christ's arm may have run down the edge of this shadow, showing him more emphatically holding onto the fabric of his mother's garment. The importance of this gesture has been examined by Paul Hills, who equates the belt and inner garments of the Virgin Mary with the funeral shroud Christ would eventually be wrapped in. The inclusion of a reference to Christ's future death fortifies the symbolism of the Christ child's horizontal pose, echoing the Pietà. With this iconography, it is possible that in its original form, Christ would have had closed eyes and that his eyes were opened by the painter of the external panels, who additionally added the baton-like cross in Christ's right hand. This cross changes the iconography from primarily a prefiguration of Christ's crucifixion, emphasized by the coral on his necklace, alluding to the blood of the Passion, to his role as ruler of the world. The addition of the cross would have required a repositioning of Christ's left arm from upright to the relaxed position it is in now. A cross-section of the pigments in the area of the crucifix has been made, and in this section there are more layers of paint than in the other samples taken, giving some physical credence to this suggestion. The subtle iconographic shift can be understood when considering the politics of Venice in the last quarter of the 15th century. In this period, Venice was struggling to maintain control over its territories along the Mediterranean against the Muslim Ottoman Empire. It is understandable that the Morosini family would have had a vested interest in refocusing its devotion towards the goal of Christian worldly domain. In fact, in 1470, around the time when the outer panels were being made, the island of Negroponte fell to the Turks. Negroponte was a key center of Venetian power in the Aegean Sea, as well as the signed birthplace of Antonio, the artist of the intersection. There is no surviving documentation to give definitive explanation to the reason these changes were carried out. It is likely that Antonio de Negroponte's original altarpiece was in fact not intended for the Morosini family, for the Morosini chapel. Suggested by its monumental scale, the placement of the original altarpiece was likely at a high altar. It could have been commissioned for San Francesco della Vigna. However, details suggest this may not be the case. In the wills of relevant Morosini family members, multiple churches are mentioned, often accompanied with benefactions. It is plausible that Marcantonio Morosini, or a contemporary relative, acquired Antonio de Negroponte's altarpiece from a different church and had it transformed by Dario de Giovanni. In this transformation, the original patron at the base of the throne was removed, and the cloth draped behind the Virgin head was altered to contain the monogram of the Morosini family. The words Ordinis and Minorum on either side of Antonio's cartouche signature were likely added at this point in time, in reference to the order of Franciscans who ministered San Francesco della Vigna. The added inclusion of the trellised garden behind the Virgin, while a standard iconographic allusion to the Virgin Mary as Hortus Conclusus, may also be understood as a reference to the vineyard that San Francesco della Vigna was founded on, as is remembered in the church's name. The final appearance of this magnificent altarpiece contains a multitude of styles and references that have, for many years, eluded definitive attribution. This was fostered by the aesthetically multicultural environment of Venice and the Veneto during the mid-Quattrocento, where references to a variety of media and styles existed simultaneously in artworks. The scholarship on 15th century Venetian painting has tended to focus on the major workshops that dominated the market, and due to the aesthetic upheaval of the Cinquecento, very few Quattrocento altarpieces survive in situ. The presumed in situ survival of the Morosini altarpiece inadvertently bolstered a conclusion that the current appearance of the altarpiece is how it was conceived of by Fra Antonio de Negroponte. Thus, the impetus to parse the multiple hands and workshops who created this altarpiece as it stands today had not yet been energetically pursued. In its exuberant display of the many currents at play in mid-Quattrocento Venice, the Morosini altarpiece is a remarkable example of the aesthetic impulses that shaped the dawn of the Renaissance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. And yes, the Roseanne Library has wonderful documentation that Jesse was able to make use of to combine this connoisseurship with technical analysis. Nice job. Questions, we're a little over time, but I think we can take a few questions because we have our intermission coming up. So shall we go ahead and take, are there questions, Faye?
Not yet.
Okay. So I'll just make a comment. I enjoy this analysis because So often people do not, or many of us do not understand that how much altarpieces might be changed over time. Oh, good. There's a question from Andrew. Faye?
Yes. Why are the garlands a symbol of modernity at the time?
Just that they had a vogue in this period. They show up in a number of altarpieces. This is just two of them. But they just have a quick vogue in this period, stop being quite so popular by really the 1480s, and are also not really seen before then. So this is just a something that's in vogue at the time.
And you mean an arch-shaped garland, right? When you say that, yeah.
Yes, they were also used by Mantegna in Santino. Thank you, Nicola.
Yes, I thought of that, yeah. Other questions? All right, well, that was a very detailed, oh, here we are, Joe has one.
Thinking about Vicky's talk of the Carpaccio cycle, do you think that similar specificity could be assigned to the birds or botanical specimens here?
Yes, it has been. And so I backed off entirely from those questions. It has been examined with some rigor by the Pellegrini wrote a very long article going over quite a bit. They compiled a huge amount of documentation that I was very lucky to be able to use. And they went through and looked at all of the birds, and many comparisons have been made or suggestions have been made about the iconography and in the bottom part.
There's a note from Jane South. There's saying unfortunately she has to go, but there was a note from Peter, I think. Did you see that?
Yeah, there's actually a question before from Roshanake Raskovich, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Question: why were eyes repainted open? This shift had a theological background?
Yes. So there's nothing inherent to definitively say that the eyes were reopened. The eyes look to me to share more similarities with other figures, but this really just goes along saying this could have happened. We know that the Dario de Giovanni was comfortable painting inside, and if my hypothesis on the change of the arm is correct, then it would make sense for the eyes to be opened, or it would make sense for the eyes to have been closed to start off with, to really emphasize the iconographic relation to the Pietà.
There was another question from Peter, I think.
I think it was more of a comment. I'm happy to read it aloud. Thanks, Jesse. You present an excellent example of the ongoing need for connoisseurship skills and an excellent example of incorporating new technical analysis. Sorry, my chat is moving. New technical analysis with art historical investigations. Connoisseurship is distinctly untrendy, but a really useful skill.
All right.
And there's further another comment from Rick Asher. I'm going to ask, there's another question from Rashanika Raskovich. Do you know another similar example, please?
Of a closed eye Madonna and Child, or Madonna and Child where the child has closed eyes. There is one that I did some research on that's currently, it's a Ferrari's Madonna and Child that's currently in the National Gallery of Scotland. That's an example from roughly the same period. There's, I think, Cosimo Tura had some. This is something that is can be seen in a number of examples.
So the closed eyes might also refer to the eventual death of Christ. So in the birth of Christ, there's often symbolism about the death of Christ. So, so good. So there was one more question, Faye?
No, I think it was just more of a comment. I don't see any more questions.